Let's see your ID,
said the portly, gray-haired security guard sitting inside the entrance of the Beijing bank with two others standing behind him. He scanned Kevin's ID and said,
Mr. McPherson's private reception is over there, and his receptionist will check you in.
They ushered him past the retinal scanner. This was Kevin's second visit but would be the first time meeting the big man. Kevin wore a light blue suit jacket and pants over a black t-shirt, and this was pretty much as formal as it got for him. Although he had a tie somewhere, he never used it. He was suspicious, but needed the work, so wanted to make a good impression. The receptionist alternately tapped a screen and typed information on her virtual keyboard as Kevin waited.
May I help you?
Yes, I'm here to see Mr. McPherson.
Kevin held out his ID. She scanned it and again returned to typing and swiping. He noticed her shiny straight black hair and the way it was cut in bangs in the front, and the only curl was a sweep forward to a point, nearing her chin, in a 1920s flapper style. She pursed her lips as she looked at the appointment, while Kevin noticed the dark liner sharply defining her lips against her cinnamon skin. She compared the image on the card to his face, then told him,
Please turn to your right.
Kevin noticed a slight accent but couldn't place it. She rotated his holographic card to change his image from looking straight ahead to a profile.
Look at the red dot.
The receptionist pointed to a small box suspended above her head. A flash of light and she captured his iris pattern. Her nose was neither large nor small, but the bridge was perfectly straight, like a Greek goddess, and he wondered if it was surgical. She wore an ink blue suit jacket with wide lapels with a thin border of white. It had the buttery sheen of high thread count wool, and on her left breast, she wore a silver snake brooch inlaid with emeralds and diamonds. Her top was low enough to allow a suggestion of rounded flesh, and his eyes darted down to her thin waist and matching short skirt. Like a salesman, he tried to boost his confidence by making time with the receptionist before the big pitch to the boss. He tried a safe line to see if he could put a crack in her ice queen demeanor.
I like your brooch. Where did you get it?
Don't try to flirt with me, Mr. Wood. I'm all business.
But?
Put your jacket and all electronic devices on the conveyor and stand on the black circle.
Kevin walked between two panels attached to robotic arms. The receptionist tapped a series of commands into her tablet and the mechanical arms began circling around his body faster and faster, whirring around his head in a blur and sinking down to his feet, emitting microwaves from one panel and receiving them in the opposite. Kevin wondered how much damage those arms would do if one of them flew off.
Does McPherson go through all this?
No, this is just for the riff-raff.
Kevin was speechless. This wasn't going as expected. The scanning stopped, and she looked at the 3D image, then glared at Kevin. Her heels clicked on the wide-format porcelain tiles as she marched up to him. She stared right into his eyes, so close he could feel her breath on his face.
You're hiding something.
What? No, I'm not.
She kneeled down and checked his socks and the cuff of his pants. Then she frisked his legs while maintaining eye contact. Still with the piercing stare, she ran her hands along his back and inside his belt.
Is there going to be a body cavity search?
Kevin asked sarcastically.
Only if I find something. Do you want me to find something, Mr. Wood? Don't lie. I can see it in your eyes.
Again, with a staring, she ran her hands across his buttocks, then over his upper thighs, then her hand moving between his legs jolted him. She cupped his genitals, and Kevin thought she lingered longer than necessary. She inhaled deeply through her nose. She's smelling me, Kevin realized. He was off balance and a jumble of humiliation and arousal. She exhaled through her mouth and licked her lips. Kevin was not sure if it meant her lips were dry or something else. Her breath felt humid and warm but had no scent at all. She spun away and returned to her terminal, heels again clicking on the porcelain.
I was wrong. There's nothing there,
she said dismissively, as she handed him his jacket.
Sorry for the inconvenience, but security is our primary concern. You can pick up your one on the way out. Electronic devices are not allowed in meetings with Mr. McPherson.
She returned to her station and smiled.
Please proceed to elevator 7 at the end of the building. It will take you directly to the 28th floor, where his assistant will meet you.
She turned and pointed with her outstretched hand, with the grace of a supermodel.
If there is anything else I can help you with.
Her eyes flickered down.
Please don't hesitate to ask.
Thanks, I might just take you up on that.
Kevin wasn't entirely sure if her words had hidden meaning. That was confusing, he thought. He turned and started walking. He checked his bulge, and decided he was still presentable.
It's from Tiffany's.
Kevin looked back over his shoulder.
What?
You asked where I got the brooch. Mr. McPherson gave it to me as a bonus last year.
Kevin smiled and nodded his head. As he continued, he had one burning question. Did she know? From the exterior of the Beijing bank, the windows appeared as though they were a single massive sheet of glass, but from the inside, you could see the clear 2DPA1 plastic beams which provided support for the photovoltaic panels. An office building is like an iceberg, and most of it is hidden beneath the surface. The stained concrete floor was poured in several layers. The bottom was a mottled color that ranged from bright rust to Bronze Age blood stains, over a base of deep mahogany and buried in a deep pool of clear resin. The patterns interlaced and washed over each other with the grace of a Chinese watercolor, then it rippled to form hills and valleys, and was then made flat and interspersed with floating swirls of translucent blue and wisps of white. Now it took shape into a realistic diorama of an indigo blue lake with dragon boats and people splashing with their oars or throwing food into the water. He walked across the solid floor, which was punctuated by pools of light from suspended LED floods, which turned on as he approached. He stepped under a multicolor laser cone and was startled by the illusion that he was standing in the sky, over a moon-sized orb emblazoned with the Beijing Bank corporate logo. He pressed the button to the elevator, and the door opened with a chime and re-scanned him. It smelled of expensive cleaning products and the burnished stainless steel door gave an illusion of 3 dimensions. Elevator 7 was an express reserved for the CEO's office, and was reserved for the big boss, his staff, and those whom he has summoned.
Welcome, Kevin Wood,
said the elevator. The doors closed and the elevator's ascent caught his stomach. Soon, it announced it had arrived at the 28th floor. The door opened, and a tall man in his early 30s, with freshly cut straight black hair, greeted him.
Hello, my name is Francis Wang, and you must be Kevin Wood.
Francis sounded very formal, yet the unexpected pause in the middle of the sentence stood out. There was a certain intensity in Francis's eyes, and a jittery disposition. When he spoke, his mouth was dry, but he didn't seem nervous. Kevin decided he looked like someone who had been to South Korea for a neural bypass or two. A way to use more of the brain was to graft neural stem cells as extra bridges to bypass bottlenecks. It was like constructing a passing lane in the brain, allowing faster thought, and granting the ability multitask. Eventually, the stem cells would turn into nerve cells, completing the connections, and the brain would learn to use them through the process of neural plasticity. Extra connections could also be made from the memory centers for factual memories, which are difficult to remember. Depending on how many bypasses were installed, this increased brain activity can cause epileptic seizures, which could lead to death or worse. The dry mouth was probably from anticonvulsive medications used to control the seizures. Kevin would have been first in line for the procedure if it weren't for the expense and the possibility of becoming a drooling vegetable for the rest of his life. Francis's speech had a grave tone and a halting rhythm, as if he was trying not to speak about 2 different subjects at the same time. Several brains and only one mouth. What to do? Kevin half expected his eyes to wander off in different directions, like a chameleon. Francis led him through a heavy door.
Mr. McPherson is ready to see you now, and I believe you previously met his lawyer, Mr. Abelman.
At the end of the long office, there were several large windows, but they displayed the view from a different city. They were holograms. Blades were drawn on the actual windows and blue light filtered down from a massive pyramid-shaped skylight above. William McPherson and Charlie Abelman sat behind the prodigious, rosewood conference table and Kevin noticed the sweet aroma it gave to the room. They stood and Kevin shook both their hands. Kevin met Abelman, the lawyer, the first time he came here. Abelman was in his late 30s and had the look of someone who doesn't go more than a couple of days without a haircut. Kevin noticed he had also recently manicured his nails and his suit cost more than he made in 2 months. McPherson held the shake a little longer than expected and looked directly into his eyes, as if he was trying to measure Kevin's soul. "What's with all the staring around here?" Kevin looked back at him with his chin raised, skeptical and curious. McPherson appeared to be in his early 60s, but may have been younger and aged by worry. He had a drawn expression and was looking at Kevin as if for deliverance from despair.
It's nice to meet you, Mr. Wood.
Thanks, the pleasure is mine.
I see you made it through security.
Yes, she was very thorough.
And thank God she is. She saved my ass more than once. I spend a fortune on the best security hardware and artificial intelligence, but there is no substitute for the intuition of a highly competent professional.
Francis poured a double of scotch in tumblers in front of McPherson, Abelman, and Kevin. He poured an equal amount of water in McPherson's and placed 2 lumps of frozen glass, shaped like ice cubes, in Abelman's.
How do you take your scotch?
Neat, thank you.
Kevin took a sip, and the explosion of flavors surprised him. He was a rum man and was not used to a fine scotch. The initial tingle of smooth alcohol gave way to subtle hints of spice, chocolate and malted barley, finally wrapped with a thick swirl of peat smoke.
How do you like the scotch? It has a rather earthy flavor.
McPherson asked, appearing to be friendly.
I didn't know dirt tasted so good.
McPherson managed a smile.
That's one way of putting it. Getting down to business, you were well recommended, and Mr. Railman reported the results from your surveillance assignment. The target was one of our own executives, Alfred North. The information you received was top shelf and his security personnel and equipment never detected you.
So, it was a setup. I'm finished my drink.
Kevin placed the tumbler on the desk and stood. His bluff seemed to work.
No, wait.
McPherson motioned for Kevin to stay seated.
Not a setup, Mr. Wood, an audition. We need to call upon reliable, competent people with your skills from time to time, so we hired a few detectives to carry out relatively simple tasks, like surveillance, to see how they measure up. I'm happy to tell you, you finished at the top.
Kevin leaned back against the leather chair with his fingers locked behind his head and gazed at McPherson with clear skepticism written on his face.
Our executive had the most sophisticated anti-surveillance gear money could buy, and you flew under the radar, as it were, and his driver didn't see a thing. We need a contractor with your discretion and ability for a much more serious issue.
Don't you have anyone on staff?
Yes, of course, but not with your special abilities. Also, for sensitive assignments, we prefer to keep our operators at, shall we say, arm's length.
I see.
Kevin's eyes narrowed.
What do you know about my family, Mr. Wood?
You are the founder of McCare Corporation. You are one of the richest people in the country. I think your son was the target of an assassination or kidnapping attempt last summer.
Yes. If it weren't for the quick action of a certain bartender who saved him. I don't suppose you know anything about that little pop gun she was carrying, do you?
Well, actually, I may know something about that.
McPherson had done his homework, and there was probably no point in trying to deny it.
You don't often see a bartender packing advanced custom-made weaponry like that. She must be special.
It was a prototype, and I gave it to her for field testing.
Not wanting to give more away about their relationship than necessary.
The way investigators described her actions, she seemed almost supernatural. To be honest, I had a hard time taking it literally, but Alan survived, and I owe you both a great deal.
Kevin didn't really like McPherson's type. There was an inherent hypocrisy with these barons. They dress in the finest suites, hang out with the most powerful and beautiful people, but at heart, they are all robbers, robber barons.
Don't thank me, it was 100% Jade who saved your son.
Be that as it may, she isn't here, and you are. I would like you to take on an assignment for me. But before you do, it would be fair to tell you about myself, so you know what you are getting into.
Kevin sensed there was something heavy coming for the old man to meet with him in person, and something pretty serious to make him look so hollowed out.
My grandfather immigrated from Scotland in 1965 and worked on the oil rigs. He saved enough money to buy a water truck and, soon, he had a fleet of them delivering water to oil rigs. My father was born, and Grandpa put him through university as a mechanical engineer. He took his share of the family business and started his own, which included directional drilling and later advanced fracking equipment and supplies. I moved in a different direction and went to MIT. I started developing software to optimize oil exploration and production, then moved into AI programs for stock and bond trading. By the time I was 30, my fortune had surpassed that of my father, and I diversified into real estate, transportation and communications. Then I started the McCare Company, and that changed everything. Using high-altitude drones, I created my own wireless communications company from the bottom up, and on a shoestring budget. I could demolish the competition and still make a large profit. It's basically a constellation of solar-powered fixed-wing platforms on autopilot hovering 20 to 30 kilometers above the Earth. They provide cell phone and data service at a fraction of the cost of standard masts or satellites. Also, they are cheap to replace, and can be upgraded where satellites cannot. Before, cell phone companies had to lease the space for each tower or antenna and install and maintain expensive equipment in thousands of locations in each city. The lease for a single location can be over $50,000 per year, and prime locations can be vastly higher. A few dozen flying wings over a city, each bigger than a van, with hardware the weight of a fat wallet, could replace them all.
A light appeared in McPherson's dull eyes when he discussed his business, and Kevin recognized a well-worn but enthusiastic promotional speech. Regardless, he knew something about the emergence of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAV, in the cell phone industry and wanted to learn more. He was warming up to the idea of working for McPherson but knew these guys would throw someone like him under the bus in a minute.
The drones were completely solar-powered and flew high above the clouds and passenger aircraft in the mid-atmosphere. Solar operates the electric motors during the day and batteries keep it operating at night. Their altitude is above the jet streams, so wind is not strong. The ideal high-altitude drone has wide, light, high-speed propellers to move through the thin atmosphere. Variable pitch propellers were not good enough. It also needed a long, ultralight wingspan. There wasn't much turbulence, so the structure didn't have to be very strong, and because of the very low air density, winds were not as destructive. A 140 km/h wind in the upper stratosphere has the same effect on the structure as a gentle spring breeze on the surface. Other companies tried dirigibles. They have an extensive surface area which is great for solar panels, but the wind blew them off course. I decided on a fixed-wing design since I can precisely position them. Mine were only 3 meters wide and launched inside a hydrogen balloon, which was like a giant amniotic sac that split open and dropped the drone when it was in a high stratosphere. The wing had a plastic 2DPA1 reinforced aerogel foam core covered with a polymer membrane. The structure was so light, 90% of the weight was from the tiny communication hardware, batteries, and motors. Although we can fly them remotely, they were almost always in a holding pattern around the center of their service area using autonomous pilot software I spent a lot developing. I designed each platform to stay in service for 5 years before we needed to land it and upgrade the hardware. Drones could transfer data to other drones at great distance using lasers. They formed a continental data network, so if a local communication service provider refused to route my calls, I could go around them. I could route them all the way to Argentina if I needed to. The connections were fast and reliable enough to replace long-distance fiber optics cables. Back then, cell frequencies were regulated and sold by the government. Some were reserved for startup companies, and I bid on them when they were available, but a couple of frequencies were not really enough for an effective wireless company. I needed longer wavelengths for penetrating buildings as well as shorter frequencies for high-speed data transfers. I became frustrated at the slow pace and cost of buying frequencies, and the competition refused to lease them to me, so I decided to borrow their frequencies. Because the angle of my waves was usually perpendicular to theirs, I caused them very little interference. No matter, they were livid and pushed the government to enforce their monopoly. They fined me, and tried to shut me down, but I appealed everything to buy time, so they tried a different approach. The competition had long, deep connections with political parties and have been heavy financial contributors for many years. At the same time the government pulled my flight permits, the other cell phone companies organized a fear campaign alleging the system would be unsafe. They owned many television stations and newspapers, which provided interviews with so-called experts who said drones represent a safety hazard and no one would be safe from them crashing to the ground or crashing airplanes. They donated money to fringe anti-Wi-Fi and other Luddite groups to organize what looked like grassroots opposition. Social media stories appeared in people's feeds regarding brain tumors and children caused by high levels of microwaves from my drones. The levels reported as being produced were so exaggerated, people expected it would be like sticking your head in a microwave oven.
So how did you deal with this?
Well, I couldn't match the money and political power of the cell phone companies, so I went about it another way. Law and regulatory enforcement were weakening, so I flew them without approval like the bootleg offshore radio stations near London 100 years ago, broadcasting from somewhere in the Atlantic. In other cases, I used blackmail, threats, and bribery against government and law enforcement. I'm not a saint, Mr. Wood, and neither was my father. Competition is not always fair, and if you want to rise above it, you can't be fair either.
Kevin pursed his lips slightly, but he was far from surprised.
Government regulation had teeth back then, but the Kessler syndrome came to the rescue. The Russians exploded one of their own satellites in 2021, and in 2025, a Chinese satellite collided with a Russian one head-on, traveling at 7.8 kilometers per second and created a cloud of millions of fragments. When other low-Earth satellites passed through the cloud, they were hit and scattered more debris, and the cloud got larger and hit more satellites, which created more debris, and so on, until it destroyed all low-Earth satellites. Even flying through the cloud to get to higher altitudes became risky. My constellation of drones became essential, and the government had to back off. The rest is history. Most cell phone towers are now rusting relics from the past, and the companies that built them, forgotten. Although my William Randolph Hearst approach to maintaining a monopoly worked for a while, there were few barriers to entry for other drone-based companies. I created the technology and set a business model, and others copied it. I couldn't stop them, short of shooting down their drones. Maybe I should have. Anyway, I went public, sold a minority stake of my shares, and diversified.
Kevin leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs, and McPherson mistook this for impatience.
Bear with me just a little longer. I'm getting to the point soon.
No worries. I could talk about technology all day.
When the Chinese loan crisis struck in 2047, and funds left Canada because of monetary delinking, it became difficult for the Bank of Beijing to remain in business here, since they desperately needed capital to prop up their operations back home. I stepped in to take it over at a fire sale price, and that's how I got in this share.
He opened his arms as if to include the entire building as well.
I wanted to put the cutthroat business behind me and become a boring old banker. Make a little more money, and pass on a stable business to my son. I think I understood the business model but underestimated the politics. Perhaps I was naive and overlooked that there were others who were not happy seeing an upstart moving in. You could say that I had earned something of a reputation as a disruptor. There were threats, extortion attempts, and even the attempted assassination of my son.
The grave look once again overcame him, and his tone lowered to a near whisper.
And now, my only son, my only child, has been kidnapped. It's been 2 days and there has been no communication from him or from his abductors. Since I suspect competing business interests were behind his assassination attempt, the same motive need be behind the kidnapping.
McPherson exhaled deeply and bowed his head with his hands clasped on the table. Mr. Abelman took this as a cue to continue.
We are asking you to find out who the kidnappers are and facilitate release or rescue. Money's no object, so any reasonable fee plus expenses will be provided. I suggest an opening retainer of 100,000 loonies, if that is acceptable to you. Naturally, the utmost discretion will be required.
That goes without saying. The retainer is good enough for now. My fee is still 500 loonies per day plus expenses, but expenses will be high.
He realized he could have probably soaked this guy for much more, but taking too much would leave him in McPherson's debt, and he didn't want to put himself in that position. He didn't like the idea that McPherson's son was kidnapped. If he was in McPherson's position, he would also do anything in his power to help someone he cared about.
You have a deal, Mr. Wood.
Abelman shook his hand.
I'll get your son back.
McPherson just nodded his head. His grief was beyond words. After the meeting, Kevin dropped by reception and held his ID under a scanner to unlock the storage box that held his one. I may be crazy, but I'd like to get to know that woman, he told himself. He walked over to the reception terminal to ask her for her chat ID, then another visitor approached her station. She gave him a nod as she spoke to the new person, and Kevin gave her a wave and left. Back in his car, he tinted the windows and pulled down his pants. He reached into his underwear and removed a small black listening device the size of a pea and uploaded the audio to his one. Did she know I had it? It was too small to be detected by the microwave scanners, so she couldn't have seen it. If she did, why did she let me go? On his way home, he tried to unpack the day's events. In his line of business, he couldn't be too judgmental. Sometimes he wished he had a straight job and didn't have to wade through the mud and could build a real life. His life, so far, was a feeble attempt at just that.